What's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. So this video is going to be a buyer's guide on the things to look for when purchasing a Mini Cooper like the one I have here. This is a 2007 Mini Cooper S or R56. This body style, or this actual design, runs from 2007 to 2013. And then once it runs over to the next year, it changes bodies. So obviously the things are going to be a little bit different. This car is equipped with a 1.6 liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. Turbocharged cars can be a little prone to common problems with the actual turbocharger system, so we're going to go over some of that stuff in this video. But this video is just going to be me going through and showing you the things to look for if you're looking at purchasing one of these vehicles for yourself. Those things are going to be cooling system issues such as water pump thermostat, cooling hoses, things like that. Oil leaks. Common ones for this car are going to be oil filter, housing gasket, valve cover gasket, oil pan gasket. These cars are also kind of notorious once they get in the higher mileage of having issues with the timing chain guides and stuff like that. So we're going to go through what to look for to see, whether or not that kind of repair has been done on the vehicle that you're looking at purchasing. Also, this car has direct injected fuel injection system on it, and a common problem with direct injected vehicles is carbon buildup on the backside of the valves. So we're going to go over how to kind of know whether or not that's a problem with the vehicle that you're looking at and what to be expecting as far as repair bills go for that. These cars also, this is a manual transmission on this vehicle. You can also get these in automatic, but I'm going to discuss, clutch repair, things like that. How to drive the car to kind of figure out whether or not the clutch is worn. These cars have some issues just with mileage, with engine mounts and suspension mounts getting worn out. Obviously, that's most cars, but these are a little bit more prone to it being like really obvious when there's problems. So I'm going to go over that stuff as well. And then I'm also going to go over just going through the whole vehicle and making sure that your power windows don't have problems, your sunroof doesn't have problems, you don't have water leaks, things like that. So this is going to be the kickoff video for a new series that I started. If you guys are interested in anything going on with this Mini after this buyer's guide video, make sure to check back with my channel. There'll be more stuff as far as maintenance and repairs goes on this car, and modifications as well. So, not much more to be said. Let's get to looking over this car and figuring out what's wrong with it. All right, so the first things you're going to do, or I would recommend doing when looking at one of these Minis purchase, is to make sure your cooling system's okay, because these cars are notorious, like a lot of German vehicles, with cooling system issues, and if the cooling system's been ran low, there's a possibility that it could blow the head gasket of the engine. So on this particular vehicle, this is going to be your coolant reservoir right here. Mine is actually a little bit low on my car, but you want to actually see the coolant be about this halfway seam here. If it's any lower than that or down at the bottom of the reservoir like mine is, you might want to start looking for cooling system leaks. That's not always the end-all be-all, because these cars actually kind of use or burn through coolant a little bit. I don't really have much of an explanation for that, other than that it's just part of life with a German vehicle. So this can be low without there actually being leaks. So some of the more common areas that you're going to find leaks on these vehicles is going to be from the thermostat housing, which is on the back side of the engine. You're going to be looking for coolant leaks down in this area, down in here. The actual thermostat housing is directly below this little wiring harness right here. But you have coolant hoses there running off the back. Some of them run back there to the firewall and into your heater core. There's also a bunch of hoses underneath here down below that are for your turbocharger coolant pump. You want to make sure that none of those hoses are leaking, as well as the hoses coming off the coolant reservoir itself. And then there is one major culprit on this vehicle that causes coolant leaks, and there's actually a coolant crossover pipe that runs from the back of the thermostat housing along the back of the motor into the back of the water pump. And that's actually a pretty notorious area that those leak, either from the O-rings on the end of it, or the plastic tube itself starts to break down and spring leaks. So we're going to jump underneath the car real quick, and I'm going to show you guys where you can look to see if that is leaking, because it's kind of difficult to see from up here because your intake manifold and stuff like that is on the back of the motor. So you're going to have to look for that coolant leak from underneath. So let's roll underneath the car real quick, and I'll show you guys where to look. All right, so now that we're underneath the car, we're going to start looking at some areas where we might be able to see some coolant leaking. First one's going to be checking for thermostat leaks. Any thermostat leaks that you're going to have are going to run down the back of the transmission here. This is actually the transmission half of the engine, or the driver's side of the car. You're going to be looking for coolant running down this area. Mine actually appears to be leaking a little bit of probably gear oil and also a little bit of coolant. You can see this like bluish green color here. That's coolant from this engine. So I'm gonna have to look and figure out where that's coming from. But that's what you're looking for, is that kind of coolant leak. And then on the other side of the engine, or the passenger side of the car, you have your drive belt system over here, along with your water pump directly associated with that drive belt system. And you're gonna wanna look up in this general area right here, this being your oil pan right here. You're gonna wanna go back a little bit and look up in here. You can see that right here on mine, right in this area right here, I actually have a little bit of dried coolant. I'm not sure if that's an active leak or if it's prior to me purchasing it, but I am going to do a pressure test on this car and actually check to make sure that that's not leaking, just because I have a low coolant reservoir. The other thing that I was talking about before, which is the coolant crossover pipe, is going to be seen from up in this area, and it's rather difficult to see just from underneath with the lighting that we have available to us, but it is up in this general area right here where I'm shining the laser at. And then I can show you, it is that plastic tube that is right above our starter motor there, that's running along the back of the motor. So that is the coolant crossover pipe that runs from the thermostat over to the water pump on the back of the motor. That is our, again, one of our more common leak areas. So that's kind of where I think that this coolant might be coming from, is actually the O-ring on the end of that pipe. And that might also be where my coolant on the other side from my transmission is coming from. So I will pressure test this and figure out where it's leaking from, and that'll end up being a video of a repair we do in the future. But that's just the kind of cooling system leaks to look for on this car. So next thing we're going to look at is oil leaks on these vehicles. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is oil leaks on this engine. So one of the easiest ones to look for, because it's directly on top, is going to be our valve cover gasket here. You can actually see, in my case, I have quite a bad valve cover gasket leak. You can see that I have a lot of like greasiness or oiliness around the valve cover area. That is going to be caused by either a cracked valve cover and or the gasket itself leaking. This is kind of what you're looking for here, is the gasket is leaking. And we come over this end of the engine, you can also see down in there that there's a lot of oil leaks down there as well. So this valve cover gasket on this car is leaking, so we'll be getting that replaced in the future as well. Another common oil leak on this vehicle is going to be from the oil filter housing gasket. Now, that is a rather difficult gasket to actually inspect. Your oil filter is actually right there. That is the nut that you use to take the oil filter off, and that oil filter goes into the oil filter housing, which is bolted to the cylinder head. Now, you're not going to be able to really tell that there's oil leaks coming from up here on that gasket, so we're going to have to roll underneath the car to check for leaks from there as well. So let's go underneath the car and I'll show you guys where to be looking at for leaks for that oil filter housing gasket. All right, so we're underneath the car now. We're towards the front of the engine, closer to the radiator, towards the middle area where the transmission and the engine meet. This is transmission, this is engine side. This is your exhaust and your catalytic converter coming off of your turbo, and then your exhaust runs out and goes that way to the back of the car. So if you're looking for an oil filter housing gasket leak from underneath here, you're going to be looking along this general area of the engine, be on the other side of the bell housing from the transmission, and also up in this area coming off of this guy right here. This right here is actually the oil cooler. There's a seal between that oil cooler and the oil filter housing gasket that can leak oil as well. So if you have oil leaking off of the backside of this oil filter housing and or down the motor in this area, you're going to be looking at that kind of repair. Again, I'll have, at the end of the video, I'll have some details about the cost of some of these repairs and what you can expect to pay, and or what the parts cost if you're going to end up doing them yourself. So the other kinds of things that leak oil underneath this car are going to be the oil pan gasket, this being your oil pan itself. You're going to be looking for leaks along these bolts here, along the front side of the engine, along the back side, and along the timing chain or timing belt, or sorry, drive belt side of things. My car actually looks like it has a little bit of wetness in that area over there, but I'm going to fix the valve cover gasket first and then clean everything off and readdress whether or not that's what's causing the leak or if it was actually an oil pan gasket. So we'll see in the future if that's what it is. So we're done talking about oil leaks on this vehicle. I'm going to move on to the next subject, which is going to be timing chain and guides and how to inspect to see whether or not they've been done. Just by looking over things and kind of seeing what's been tampered with and what hasn't. So let's get on to that. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at on this is whether or not the timing chain has been done on this engine. So it's kind of difficult to know other than having like service records to verify for sure. But you can kind of look at some of the things that are required to take off in order to do the timing chain and get an idea of whether or not they've been removed before. One of those is going to be the valve cover. So in our situation, our valve cover has actually never been off before. It doesn't look like it's ever been off before, obviously by the fact that it's leaking. So I'm thinking that the timing chain has not been done on this car. But if the valve cover might have been done by someone due to a leaking gasket or the valve cover itself having an issue, that's not always an end-all tell of whether or not the timing chain stuff has been done. Another thing to look for is whether or not the engine mount along this side has ever been removed. You can usually tell by looking at bolts and seeing whether or not they have what they call witness marks, where it looks like tools have been applied to them. You can look at that. You can also come down in here. I have taken the wheel off for this situation, but you can turn the wheel to one side and kind of get an idea by looking in here. But you want to look at things like the crankshaft bolts and stuff like that that hold the crankshaft in place. So in there, there's some E-Torx bolts that hold the crankshaft pulley on to the end of the crankshaft. You can kind of look at those and get an idea of whether or not those have been removed before. You can also potentially look and see if there's any kind of like squirted out RTV that doesn't look normal or doesn't look factory or looks cleaner than the rest of the engine, or if parts over here have been replaced, such as the crankshaft pulley, or maybe the seal behind it's clean and brand new, because you can actually see the seal for the front crankshaft through the holes in the pulley there. Also in my situation, it looks like we have a replaced wheel for the drive belt. That's another wear item on these cars, pretty common. But obviously we can see that some work was done over here, but I don't know exactly what. From what I got from the previous owner, I was told the water pump and things like that were done, so I don't think that's going to be an issue on this car, but I don't know how far they actually got into. So the only thing you can really do for timing change is just kind of inspect the areas that might have been tampered with in order to replace the timing chain and or guides, and try to get an idea about whether or not they've been removed in order to get access to that timing chain. So we are going to move on to inspecting for carbon buildup, or how to actually drive the car to look for our carbon buildup issues. And I also, in that same section, will talk about how to drive the vehicle to inspect to see whether or not the clutch is worn out and is slipping. So let's move on to that. All right, so obviously with any vehicle that you're purchasing, I would recommend bringing some kind of cheaper scan tool, or what we call a code reader, to pull fault codes out of the vehicle you're dealing with, to kind of figure out if it has any faults, if it has any history faults, or stuff that somebody might have cleared just before you came to look at it and it's not had a chance to turn the light back on. You can potentially diagnose a carbon buildup issue by looking at faults in there and kind of searching for what those faults are related to. It's hard to say the actual faults that might get set by that, because I've not experienced an issue with one of these vehicles where carbon buildup has set a fault. It normally just ends up being something that you can kind of tell when you're driving. So the way I've always been able to know if cars have issues while driving that have carbon buildup is just a lack of power from what you feel like it should have for what kind of vehicle it is. So that might be a little bit more difficult for you to know if you've never driven one of these cars before. But obviously, if you're driving this and this is an upgrade from the car you have now, and it feels the same as the car that you're driving now or slower than your current car, then that's kind of a dead giveaway. Then it might have a little bit of carbon buildup issue. The other thing that you can know for sure if it's got a carbon buildup issue is while you're accelerating in these cars, if you have like a surging engine power, like you're accelerating in a gear and it kind of like sputters and at points in the RPM range and doesn't feel like it's accelerating, and then kind of works its way through that and starts accelerating okay, that can be an indication of carbon buildup. And what's causing that is just a poor airflow through the intake system and into the cylinders due to the carbon buildup. The other thing I wanted to go over is checking for clutch wear. So that's another thing that's just going to require driving in order to know. Industry accepted standard for automotive field to check for clutch wear is to, while driving the vehicle, doing say 30-ish miles an hour, is to put the shifter into 6th gear and try to accelerate in 6th gear. The reason why that causes clutch slippage is because it's a lot of load on the engine and transmission in order to try to accelerate in such a high gear, because your 5th and 6th gears are what they call overdrive gears. So they're actually not reduction gears, and they're not aiding in acceleration. They're a cruising gear. So when you try to accelerate in those gears, it requires a lot of oomph from the engine in order to do so. And if it has clutch slippage issues, it will slip in that load range in that gear. So you're going to want to do 30-ish miles an hour, put the transmission in 6th gear, and try to accelerate. Another way that you can know real quick right away is trying to accelerate in pretty much any gear up a hill. That'd be a dead giveaway too, because when you try to climb a hill in a gear, that's again a lot of load on the transmission and will cause the clutch to slip. So we are going to now move on to checking out some of the more common rubber bushings that wear out in this, that being engine mounts and suspension mounts and or suspension parts and stuff like that. So let's move on to that. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is check over some of our rubber bushings and things like that on these vehicles that can wear out. The first ones that you want to look at are going to be up top, don't require you to crawl around the ground, are going to be engine mounts from up here. There are 2 on this engine. There's one on this side, on the passenger side, that's holding it on this frame rail over here, and then there's one over here underneath all this plastic stuff and your washer fluid reservoir and stuff like that, that's holding it on this frame rail. So they're pretty easy to tell whether or not they have wear. You're going to look in here past this headlight down here, and you're actually going to see right here where I'm pointing at, this is the actual part that the engine itself is sitting on. Let's see if I can, there we go. This part right here is the part that the engine itself is sitting on, and this is the mount that's mounted to the frame rail. And then in between those two, in this little gap right here where my laser is pointing, is a rubber bushing. That's the rubber bushing that the engine is actually floating on to keep it from being hard mounted to the body. So when these mounts wear out, this gap here between this upper part and this lower part here where it's mounted on the body actually closes up and ends up resting on that. So in here, you can kind of see right through there where that gap is at. That gap will close up and that engine mount, that upper part of the engine mount will be resting on that lower part. That's an indication that this engine mount is worn out. Another way that you can know for sure that you're having engine mount issues is just a lot of vibration in the car with the engine running. On this side, you're going to inspect this one through this area right through here, and that is potentially having to pull this tube right here back out of the way. And you're going to look down in here and again look for the spacing on this rubber mount down here at the bottom, right here where my finger is pointing. That mount right there, you have an upper part that's mounted to the body of the car, the other lower part is mounted to the transmission, and you're going to look for the spacing to be closed up on that rubber gap there. This car, when I first bought it, had pretty worn out mounts, so it was the first thing I did to this car. I don't have a video on that, I apologize, but it was just so bad that I literally, the day that I bought it, I replaced them. So that's why you don't see a gap on mine, because they're not worn out because I replaced them. So we're going to roll underneath the car, and I'm going to show you the other engine mount that could potentially have wear in it, as well as the suspension mounts and points on the suspension that you need to be checking to make sure there's not any play. All right, so the other engine mount that we're going to check out is going to be this guy right here. Now, this is directly behind our oil pan. It mounts between the engine and the subframe itself. This is what you would call a torque arm. This keeps the engine from rocking back and forth under load when you're accelerating, deaccelerating, things like that. So on this one, you're going to be looking for cracking in this rubber here on the bottom and as well as on the top. That cracking indicates that the bushing is actually worn out. This is also another engine mount that I've already replaced, so obviously it doesn't have any problems. The other things that we're looking for suspension-wise are going to be worn out ball joints. There's a lot of videos online on how to check these, so I'm not going to really go over that. Tie rods, ball joints, sway bar end links, which are these guys right here. You're going to pull up and down on this sway bar here with your hand, make sure there's not play. It mounts up there at the top on the strut as well. Just make sure there's no play in either end. That's the same for both sides. And then the other thing that wears out on these pretty commonly is going to be this rear control arm bushing. This control arm bushing gets a lot of like torque load pushed in towards the center of the car when you hit the brakes, because of the way that this wishbone style arm is set up. So these are a common wear item as well. I don't see a whole lot of problem at the other ball joint up here on this arm where it mounts to the subframe, but that can also be a wear point too, so just make sure you're checking that as well. The only other suspension bushings that you would have to worry about on this car obviously are any of the ones that are in the rear of the car. Again, you just want to check for cracking on the rubber like you would on this style bushing. You're going to check for cracks in the rubber between the center part and the outside part. These don't really have a whole lot of problems with the bushings in the rear wearing out, just because there's not a lot of weight and not a lot of stress put on them. You're more interested in looking at the front ones just because of the fact that the engine's up here and there's a lot of weight. So that is it for engine and suspension mounts. We're going to move on to the next part of this video. All right, so after you've checked over all the more common things that these cars have wrong, oil leaks, coolant leaks, worn engine mounts, suspension mounts, making sure that you don't have a ton of carbon problems and or a worn clutch, those being your more expensive repairs that might keep you from driving the vehicle, the next thing you're going to want to move on to is just a general check over the rest of the vehicle. Obviously making sure that your power windows work, power window switches being down here, making sure that you don't have any bulb out warning messages that'll show up in this instrument display right here as a yellow light showing that there's a light being out somewhere. These vehicles are actually super notorious for the sunroof mechanism breaking and not working. This car actually, the sunroof does not work on, so that's on a list of things that I need to do. But make sure that you're checking up. Sunroof controls are up here. You have your interior lights, stuff like that. Make sure all that stuff works. These cars have manual seats for all the adjustment points, so there's not really anything to break there as far as power seats go. It's a super basic car. There's, again, not a whole lot going on. This one's had an aftermarket radio put in it, I'm assuming because the factory radio went out. That's a rather common issue with these as well. Also, this being replaced, this is a little different, but with the factory, there's a lot of buttons and stuff here, and then this display here is actually a display on the factory car. These displays tend to lose pixels or grow out, so that might have also been the reason why somebody replaced it. I'm not really sure. Obviously, I bought the vehicle with this like this. So just make sure you're doing a thorough inspection of all that kind of stuff. Don't skip over it, because it can end up being things that affect your ownership of the vehicle, and if you end up wanting to fix them, can be costly repairs, such as sunroof repairs on this vehicle are in the thousands of dollars. So just do your due diligence and check everything you can on the vehicle. Other than that, we are done with this buyer's guide on this car. If you guys have any questions about this or anything else that might go wrong with these cars, please make sure you comment down below. Be sure to answer any questions you guys have. Other than that, I'll see you guys later. Hey, so I realized in editing that I forgot to include two things in this video. Not really anything that I can show you guys on the car, but stuff that I can talk about. These cars do have two more common things. That would be turbocharger failure. I haven't seen it a whole lot out of the probably hundreds of these cars I've worked on. It's happened once or twice. Quick way to know whether or not that's an issue is excessive white smoke from the tailpipe while driving the vehicle and or while it's just sitting there running. That normally indicates that the turbocharger seals have failed and is causing oil to be pushed into the turbocharger and burned off in the engine. The other thing that these have problems with, again, not super common, but I have seen it, is high pressure fuel pump problems. That's normally gonna also show up as like a hesitation or lack of power while driving, and will usually end up setting a fault for low pressure in the high pressure fuel system because it has a sensor in there that's capable of detecting the fuel oil pressure. So those are just two other things to look out for. Again, not as common as some of the other things I went over, but things that you need to be looking out for, and a lot of times are obvious and or can be found by doing fault code search in the vehicle. So again, hopefully this video helps everyone out. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you later.